Hello there. Welcome to the biology unit of grade 10. This unit we're going to focus first on cells and the little components inside of them. And then later on we're going to learn a little bit more about how those cells reproduce and how they can combine together to make organs and organ systems as we go along. So first of all, we're going to look at the cells themselves. We're going to start with really tiny ones like the bacteria in this yogurt. And then we're going to look at the larger ones that you find in multicellular organisms like Obi the cat here and this money tree, which are a few that I have around the house. So one way of organizing cells is by looking at the evolutionary relationships, which we call the tree of life. And if you look at any group like plants or animals, there are components of their cells that are all the same. And so that's how we group them together, by the similar traits and the similar features of their cells and the way they organize themselves. And so what we find is that there are traits that all living things have the same. And so the theory is that that is what the ancestor would be of all of the tree of life way back in the deep past, 3.5 billion years ago or so. And we call that the last universal common ancestor, or LUCA. And so LUCA would have been a single-celled organism long time ago. And from that, we would have had our bacteria and archaea, which are the simplest forms of life that we still have here on the planet. And those type of cells we call prokaryotes. And eventually, the more complex cells that make up plants, animals, fungi, and protists, and that group is called the eukaryotes. And so we're going to have a look at the simplest cells first and have a look at what they have in common, and then we'll look at the more complex ones next. So starting with prokaryotes, this is a picture under a microscope. You can see that they're ridiculously tiny. If you took some of that yogurt from the first slide and smeared it onto a slide, you might be able to see little tiny dots like this under the highest power of a light microscope, and little clumps of these bacteria that turn the milk into yogurt. And so features that you might find on your typical prokaryote, if you could zoom in any further, would be that you'd see that there's some DNA, of course not color-coded like this, but you definitely have some DNA in there. Usually it's in a central region with a few other loops of DNA that we call plasmids that are sometimes around. You would find simple organelles that don't have membranes, like ribosomes, that change the DNA into proteins that do various duties around the cell. There would be an inner membrane on the inside, so membrane, and then a cell wall, and then a thick capsule, and then these little communication or attachment devices that are called pili, these little guys, and usually some form of locomotion like this flagellum. Flagella, there you are. So most bacterium have some variation of this group of features, and for a long, long time that's the only type of cell that there was here on planet Earth. Very simple, very effective at evolving to survive in a whole bunch of different environments. But eventually more complexity evolved, and that's where we go to next. So the big difference between eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells are that eukaryotic cells, being larger, have internal membranes, not just the membrane on the outside. Of course, all cells have a cell membrane. But eukaryotic cells are larger and have a whole bunch of internal membranes that enclose organelles on the inside. And so some classic ones that we're going to go through that you've probably heard of course, the main one in the middle there is going to be the nucleus, and it holds the DNA, right? And then you've got these membranes that are close to the nucleus that we call the endoplasmic reticulum. And you probably recognize this guy here, that's a mitochondrial mitochondria. And you might remember this guy, this funny sounding name, Golgi body. And what else do we have here? A few of these little guys we call vesicles. So all those are internally membrane-bound organelles that are features of eukaryotic cells that make them different from prokaryotes. So the first of our membrane-bound organelles that we're going to look at, of course, is the nucleus. And inside the nucleus, you're going to have DNA. The DNA will be in sections called chromosomes. And chromosomes are just stretches of DNA that are continuous, right? So you, instead of having one long circular loop like you have inside of a prokaryote, in eukaryotes you have multiple stretches of chromosomal DNA. When the cell is going to replicate, these chromosomes condense into this sort of recognizable form, and you can see that under light microscope if your timing's right. And then you need a much more powerful microscope to be able to zoom in beyond that to get down to this double helix shape, which is the DNA, which has sections of it that are copied and read to make proteins. Those sections we call genes. And if you like this stuff, stick with biology and you'll learn all about gene expression and how that works inside of cells as you go on in your schooling. So our next organelle that we're going to have a look at here are the mitochondria. They're usually represented by these sort of kidney bean shapes. They have their own internal membranes inside of them, and what they are very good at doing is making lots and lots of energy molecules for the cell. And so a prokaryote, of course, will do the same sort of thing. It'll take some glucose and oxygen and break it down to make some energy molecules for itself. And you'll end up making carbon dioxide and the water. But what a mitochondria does is it just amps that up, like makes 15 times more from the same amount of glucose. These chemical energy molecules are called ATP, and you'll learn about them later in biology, but I'll plant that seed now. These neat little molecules that are used to do all the processes that require energy within a cell. Alrighty, our next organelle is related to the mitochondria. These are very good at doing the reverse reaction, which is taking the carbon dioxide and the water and turning that into the glucose, which, if you remember, is C6H12O6. There's your glucose. And some oxygen as a waste product. And that is going to require some sunlight. And the reason that they're green is that they absorb all the other colors. They absorb the red end and the purple end of the spectrum. And what reflects off is the green. So it's the unused energy that the plants or protists don't use, which is what we see as green. So under the microscope, you'll see these little organelles, lots and lots of them within the leaves of plant cells or protists, and they are busy harvesting the energy from the sun to make glucose, which is the storage molecule for that energy. All right, so our next organelles we're going to have a look at are these flattened, sort of pancakey looking ones that are close to the nucleus. These are called the endoplasmic reticulum, all the orange ones I've drawn here. If it's close to the nucleus and it looks kind of flat, that's endoplasmic reticulum. Some of them have little dots on them. They call those rough endoplasmic reticulum. Those are the ribosomes you see on there. And others are smooth. And so different stuff happens in different places. You can kind of think of them as being like factories. They'll take the instructions from the DNA inside of the nucleus, and they're right next to it. And so they'll form proteins and other molecules for use inside the cell as kind of like a factory. The second organelle we're going to look at here, the Golgi. The Golgi bodies or Golgi apparatus are like the finishing places. They'll take the molecules that are been started by the endoplasmic reticulum. They'll fold them and turn them into their final form. and then they'll deliver them somewhere. It might be that they're secreted, like spit out outside of the cell. Think of something like saliva enzymes. They would have made inside of cells and then eventually put outside of the cell to end up in your mouth. Or it could be something that's internal, inside of the cell, that's needed by another process. Our next organelle that has a membrane is going to be the vacuoles. Animal cells can have lots of these. They are little membrane-bound sacs that can contain stuff. They can be like the trash bin, right? They could have a whole bunch of waste and collect it there and then eventually spit it outside of the cell to be processed somewhere else. They can have nutrients that you are saving to use for other purposes, like maybe building those proteins in the endoplasmic reticulum. They could have extra water if it's needed for certain processes. Inside of a plant cell, there's usually only one, and it's huge. And it has an added purpose of being the part of the cell that maintains the pressure on the cell wall. I don't know if you've ever left vegetables out overnight, like a celery or some carrots, and by morning they'll be all kind of droopy and floppy, and that's because some of the water's left and these vacuoles aren't putting pressure on the cell wall anymore, and so all the cells kind of go floppy, and you don't have that rigid structure, so that they don't stand up as well. So finally, a little comparison. Plant cells and animal cells under a microscope usually have a couple things that you can use to distinguish them. First of all, having these sort of rigid and kind of straight line cell walls being packed together as they are is a main feature of plant cells, right? They'll have this nice sort of almost brick-like appearance where they all fit together really tightly. And sometimes they'll have chloroplasts. So if you have leaf cells from a plant, they'll definitely have some chloroplasts. But if you take like some cells from, say, the bark of the plant or the root of the plant, they won't necessarily have chloroplasts in them. This here is an onion cell. Onions, of course, are like under the ground, and they're like a root structure. And of course, they don't have the chloroplasts there. So they can have the chloroplasts. And then the other thing that they have is, in order to keep their cell walls brick-like and able to keep their structure, they have those large vacuoles, usually some empty space inside each of these cells that you can see is filled with water, and that's what gives the cells their shape and the structure that they have. And so those three features distinguish your plant cells from your animal cells. Pretty much everything else inside them is very similar. They'll have all those other organelles doing all those other jobs at the same time. These here are some cheek cells under a microscope, and you can see they've been stained, and you can see the little nucleus inside of them. And they'll have all the same features of the plant cell, but they won't have the big cell wall, they won't have the big vacuoles, and of course they won't have the chloroplasts. All right, I hope that helped, and we'll talk to you soon.